Her voicemail came in at 2:17 a.m. 3 seconds of silence, then her voice flat and cold, like she was speaking to a stranger instead of her own child. "Don't ever come back, you're not my daughter anymore." I sat there in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the words echo again and again. By the time the sun rose, I had replayed that message 26 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because part of me still couldn't believe she had actually said it. By sunset, I wasn't listening anymore. I was planning. Because the moment she told me to never return, she forgot one very important thing. I knew every secret she had, and I knew exactly where they were hidden. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'm Brooke Simmons, and what I'm about to share is the story of how the person who tried to erase me from her life ended up losing everything she had spent decades building. And it all started with that voicemail. I didn't cry at first, my body didn't even let me. My hands went numb, my jaw locked so tight it ached. It felt like someone had hollowed out my chest and filled it with cold air. Because the voice on that message was just anyone. It was my mother, Diane Simmons. To the outside world she was admired, a respected real estate developer, elegant, powerful, the kind of woman who walked into a room and instantly owned it. To me, she was something very different. She was the reason I learned, very young, that love could feel like a transaction. Growing up in her house felt like living inside a performance. Everything had to be perfect. The floors were always spotless, the furniture arranged like a showroom, and the air constantly smelled of lemon cleaner and quiet tension. Mistakes weren't punished with shouting. They were punished with silence. When I was 12, I brought home a report card with one B on it. Just one, everything else was A's. I thought she'd at least acknowledge the rest. Instead, she read it, folded it carefully, placed it on the counter, and didn't speak to me for 3 days. No yelling, no explanation, just absence. That kind of silence does something to a kid. It trains you to chase approval like oxygen, to measure your worth by how little trouble you cause. By the time I became an adult, I was already conditioned to shrink myself around her. And she liked it that way. 2 days before the voicemail, we had our final conversation. I was standing in her kitchen, the same kitchen where I had spent years trying to read her moods from the sound of her footsteps. The overhead lights were bright, almost harsh, reflecting off the marble countertops. She was stirring tea, calm as ever. "You embarrassed me," she said, not looking up. My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "At the fundraiser," her spoon tapped the cup softly, "you corrected me in front of people." I blinked, confused. "You told them I was still working as your assistant. I just said I run my own firm now." That was the truth. After years of working under her shadow, I had finally built my own legal consulting business. It wasn't huge, but it was mine. She set the spoon down slowly and finally looked at me. Her eyes were sharp, measuring. "You could have stayed quiet." That sentence hit harder than any insult, because it summed up our entire relationship. Be successful, but not more than her. Be independent, but never visibly so. Be strong, but never challenge her authority. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you," I said quietly. "I was just being honest." Her lips tightened. Honesty is overrated when it undermines family. Family. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Because what she meant wasn't loyalty. She meant control. That conversation ended with her walking out of the room, leaving me standing there feeling 12 years old again. Small, guilty, wrong, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I should have known then that something bigger was coming, that her silence afterward wasn't calm, it was calculation. For 2 days she didn't answer my calls. Then at 2:17 a.m. the voicemail came. And just like that, I was erased. At first I told myself she didn't mean it, that she was just angry, that she would cool down. But the next morning proved me wrong. I drove to her house anyway, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole way, part of me still hoping she would open the door, sigh, and say something like, "You know how dramatic I get." Instead, I found the locks changed, and taped to the front door was a plain white envelope with my name written in her neat handwriting. Inside was a letter. Short, formal, brutal. It said she had removed me from her will, that she had severed all financial and personal ties, that any attempt to contact her would be considered harassment. At the bottom was one final line: "You are no longer part of this family." I stood there on the porch reading those words, while the wind rustled the trees overhead. My vision blurred, but no tears came. Because something else was happening inside me. Something colder, heavier. A realization was settling in, piece by piece. This wasn't just a mother cutting off her daughter in anger. This was a strategic move. And the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. Because there was one thing my mother valued more than control, more than reputation, more than even family. She valued her empire. And I knew something about that empire, something she never imagined would matter one day. I knew how it was built. And I knew exactly what could bring it crashing down. That night, for the first time since hearing the voicemail, I finally felt something close to calm. Because I understood something very clearly now. She hadn't just told me to never return. She had handed me the key to her own destruction. And she had no idea yet that I was already turning it. The night after I found that letter on her door, I didn't sleep. I lay on my couch staring at the ceiling, the glow from the streetlight outside slicing through my living room in thin orange lines. My phone rested on my chest, heavy like a brick, as if that voicemail was still physically inside it, pressing down on me. At first, my thoughts weren't about revenge. They were about disbelief. Because when someone erases you, the first reaction isn't anger, it's confusion. Your mind keeps trying to rewrite reality. It searches for reasons, for explanations that make the pain smaller. Maybe she didn't mean it. Maybe she'd call tomorrow. Maybe this was just another one of her power plays. But deep down I knew better. My mother didn't do temporary decisions. Everything she did was permanent, calculated, strategic. And this time she hadn't just cut me off emotionally. She had cut me off legally, financially, socially. She had removed me from every part of her world. And that realization hit hardest when I checked my email the next morning. There was a notice from the firm managing her properties. My access credentials had been revoked. My consulting contract with her company terminated. Even my parking authorization at her office building was cancelled. Every door closed at once. It felt like watching a city shut down around you while you're still standing in the middle of the street. That was when the first real wave of emotion hit me. Not sadness, not grief, humiliation. Because it wasn't enough for her to cut me off privately. She had to make sure everyone knew, every employee, every partner, every contact in her network. She had turned it into a public Excel. And that hurt more than anything. For 2 days I walked around in a fog. I barely ate. My stomach twisted whenever I tried. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't take a full breath. But the worst part was the silence. No calls. No messages. No attempt to explain. It was like I had vanished from her life completely. And then on the 3rd day, something happened that shifted everything. I got a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. It was Daniel, my mother's former financial controller. He had resigned abruptly the previous year. At the time, she told everyone he left because of personal reasons. But his voice sounded tense when I answered. "Brooke, I heard what happened." My heart tightened. Heard what? That she cut you off. The fact that he knew meant one thing. She hadn't just told a few people. She had announced it. Like a press release. I swallowed hard. Yeah, it's done. There was a long pause on the line. Then he said something that made my pulse spike. "You need to be careful." The way he said it wasn't casual. It sounded urgent. "Why?" I asked. His voice dropped lower. "Because you know things, Brooke, things she never wanted anyone else to know." My fingers tightened around the phone. Like what? Another pause. And then he said the words that cracked something open inside me. You remember those offshore property accounts you used to process paperwork for? The air left my lungs. Because suddenly I knew exactly where this conversation was going. Years ago, when I still worked closely with my mother's company, I had helped review legal documentation for several international property deals. At the time, she told me they were normal tax structures, common in real estate. But I had noticed inconsistencies, hidden ownership layers, transfers that didn't align with reported valuations. I had questioned her once. She had shut me down instantly. Focus on what you're told to focus on, she said coldly. You don't need to understand everything. Back then I let it go. Because I was still trying to earn her approval. Still trying to believe she wasn't capable of anything illegal. Now, hearing Daniel mention it, my chest tightened with a different feeling. Clarity. Why are you telling me this? I asked quietly. His answer came without hesitation. Because the way she cut you off, it means she sees you as a threat. My stomach twisted. And if she sees you as a threat, he continued, she won't just stop at cutting ties. She'll try to protect herself. The implications settled over me slowly. Heavy, chilling. Protect herself from me. That meant one thing. She wasn't just angry. She was scared. And the moment that realization landed, something inside me shifted permanently. Because fear only appears when there's something to lose. And my mother had everything to lose. Her reputation. Her business empire. Her carefully curated image. All of it rested on the illusion that she was untouchable. And I knew exactly where the cracks in that illusion were. That night I went into my home office and opened a locked drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was an old external hard drive. I plugged it into my laptop, my hands steady now in a way they hadn't been for days. File after file appeared on the screen. Contracts, financial records, ownership documents, emails, evidence of transactions that didn't match public filings. At the time I had saved them, I told myself it was just professional caution. A lawyer's instinct to keep records. But now, looking at them, I realized something else. I had unknowingly been holding her greatest vulnerability all along. I sat there in the dim light of my office, scrolling through the documents, feeling something unfamiliar spreading through my chest. Not rage. Not sadness. Power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one at her mercy. She was at mine. And that realization didn't bring me immediate satisfaction. It brought something colder. A quiet, steady determination. Because revenge, I realized, isn't about explosive anger. It's about patience, precision, timing. And as I closed my laptop that night, one thought repeated clearly in my mind. She thought erasing me would protect her. But she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because now I had nothing left to lose. And everything she had was suddenly within my reach. I didn't act right away. That's the thing about real revenge. It doesn't happen in a burst of anger. It grows slowly, like pressure building inside a sealed container, quiet and invisible until the moment it explodes. For days after finding those files, I just sat with them. Every night I opened the hard drive and reviewed one folder at a time. Contracts, property transfers, emails written in my mother's precise, polished tone. On the surface, everything looked legitimate, but once you knew where to look, the cracks were obvious. Fake shell companies, undervalued property declarations, money quietly rerouted through offshore accounts. It wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. And the deeper I dug, the more my chest tightened with a strange mix of emotions. Shock at how far she'd gone. Betrayal, because she had used me to help process some of those documents. And a slow, rising clarity. She hadn't just cut me off because she was angry. She had cut me off because she was afraid. Afraid that one day I might see the full picture. Afraid that one day I might speak. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something that made my stomach twist. She hadn't just erased me from her life to protect herself from a potential threat. She had erased me because she believed I would stay silent. Because that's what I had always done. Stayed quiet. Stayed loyal. Stayed small. But this time, she had pushed me past that point. The turning moment came one evening, while I was reviewing a set of internal emails from 6 years earlier. I found one message she had sent to her senior management team after a regulatory audit scare. The subject line read, "Containment Strategy." I clicked it. My heartbeat already picking up. Her words were calm, clinical. If any internal documentation becomes exposed, ensure all individuals connected to preliminary processing are discredited immediately. Personal reputation damage will neutralize their credibility. I read that sentence 3 times. And then it hit me. Like ice water poured down my spine. She hadn't just been planning to protect herself legally. She had been planning for years how to destroy anyone who could expose her. Including me. The realization made my hands tremble, but not from fear. From anger. Cold, steady anger that settled deep in my chest. Because suddenly the voicemail made perfect sense. It wasn't just emotional rejection. It was preemptive damage control. She had cut me off publicly so that if I ever spoke out, I would look like a bitter, estranged daughter seeking revenge. Unstable. Untrustworthy. Easy to dismiss. She hadn't just tried to erase me. She had tried to disarm me. And that realization flipped something inside me completely. Because now this wasn't just personal anymore. This was survival. And that's when my planning truly began. I didn't rush to authorities immediately. That would have been reckless. My mother had too much influence, too many connections. If I moved too quickly, she could spin the narrative before I even had a chance to present the evidence. So I did what she had always done. I became patient. Meticulous. Strategic. For the next 3 months, I lived a double life. During the day, I continued running my consulting firm, smiling during meetings, acting like everything was normal. At night, I worked quietly building a case. I organized the files into timelines, cross-referenced property transactions with public records, documented every discrepancy. Sometimes I worked until dawn, my eyes burning, my body exhausted, but my mind sharper than it had ever been. Because each piece of evidence I confirmed made the picture clearer. And the clearer it became, the more I realized something shocking. Her entire empire wasn't just built on ambition. It was built on deception. Inflated property valuations to secure loans. Tax evasion through offshore shell companies. Hidden partnerships designed to conceal ownership trails. It wasn't just one illegal move. It was a system. A carefully engineered machine designed to look legitimate while operating in the shadows. And she had maintained that illusion for decades. But illusions are fragile. All they need is one crack. And I had enough evidence to shatter everything. The first time I imagined what would happen when the truth came out, my stomach churned. Not from guilt. From anticipation. Because I knew exactly what mattered most to her. Not money. Not assets. Reputation. Her entire identity was built on being admired, respected, feared. Losing that would hurt her more than any financial penalty. And that was when I knew what my real goal was. Not just legal consequences. Total exposure. I wanted the world to see who she truly was. The woman behind the polished smile and perfect image. The one who discarded her own daughter like a liability. The one who built success on deception. But I also knew this had to be done carefully. Because if I made one mistake, she would turn the situation against me. She always had that ability to twist narratives, to make herself the victim. So I waited. I gathered more evidence. And then one unexpected opportunity appeared that changed everything. It came through an industry newsletter, a headline announcing a major upcoming event, a national real estate leadership conference. My mother was listed as the keynote speaker. The theme of her talk: integrity and trust in modern development. When I read that line, a quiet laugh escaped my lips. Not a happy laugh. The kind that comes when something is so deeply ironic, it almost feels unreal. Because suddenly I saw it. The perfect moment. The perfect stage. A room full of industry leaders. Media coverage. Public attention focused entirely on her. And she would be standing there, presenting herself as the face of ethical business. The contrast would be devastating. And in that moment, sitting alone at my desk, staring at that announcement on my screen, I realized something with absolute certainty. The woman who told me to never return was about to face the one thing she had feared most her entire life: public humiliation. And this time, there would be no silence to protect her, because I was finally ready to speak. The moment I saw her name listed as the keynote speaker, something inside me went completely still. Not calm in a peaceful way. Calm in the way the air feels right before a storm breaks. For years, my mother had controlled every narrative. She shaped how people saw her, how they talked about her, even how they thought about her. She lived inside a carefully polished image that she guarded like a fortress. And now, she was about to step onto a stage and preach about integrity. The irony wasn't just bitter. It was perfect. I didn't rush into action. That would have been emotional, sloppy, exactly the kind of mistake she expected from me. Instead, I planned. First, I made copies of everything, multiple encrypted backups stored in different places. I even printed key documents and sealed them in envelopes labeled with dates and transaction codes. Because if there was one thing my mother had taught me, it was this: never rely on a single point of failure. Then I contacted someone I trusted professionally, but who had no connection to her network, an investigative attorney known for handling corporate fraud cases. I didn't tell him everything at first, just enough to make him curious. When he reviewed the first batch of documents, his expression changed from polite interest to sharp focus. He leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Do you understand how serious this is?" I nodded. "I do." He looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. "If this is verified, this could dismantle her entire operation." There it was. Not revenge language. Not emotional terms. Just fact. Dismantle. And hearing that word felt strangely grounding. Because it reminded me this wasn't about rage anymore. This was about truth. For weeks after that meeting, we worked carefully, quietly, building a legally airtight case, verifying every piece of evidence so nothing could be dismissed as speculation. And during that time, my mother remained silent. No calls. No attempts to reach out. It was as if I had truly ceased to exist to her. At first, that silence hurt. Then it hardened me. Because it confirmed something I had spent years trying to deny. She hadn't loved me conditionally. She had never loved me at all. I had simply been useful. Until I was. The day of the conference arrived faster than I expected. It was held in a massive hotel ballroom, bright with chandeliers and polished marble floors. The air buzzed with conversation, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of professional networking. I stood near the back of the room, dressed simply, unnoticed. Watching her, she looked exactly the same. Confident, composed, elegant in a tailored navy suit. When she stepped onto the stage, the audience applauded warmly, admiringly. My chest tightened for a moment, because part of me remembered being a little girl watching her from the sidelines, feeling proud when people clapped for her. But that feeling didn't last. Because then she began speaking. Her voice rang clear through the microphone. In business, integrity isn't optional, it's the foundation of trust. The words echoed across the room, polished and rehearsed. And something inside me shifted permanently. Not anger. Not sadness. Just clarity. Because in that moment, I saw her exactly as she was. Not a mother. Not a victim. Just a person who had spent her life building a lie. And that was when I gave the signal. Within minutes, several journalists in the audience received an email. Anonymously sent. Containing a detailed dossier. Financial records. Transaction timelines. Ownership structures. And one line at the top. Evidence of large-scale property fraud connected to keynote speaker Diane Simmons. At first, nothing changed. She continued speaking unaware. But then I saw it happen. A ripple moved through the audience. Phones lighting up. Whispers spreading. Expressions shifting from admiration to confusion. One journalist stood up abruptly and walked toward the exit, already dialing someone. Another stared at his screen, eyes wide. And then it reached her. She noticed the distraction, the movement, the sudden tension in the room. Her speech faltered mid-sentence. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. Someone in the front row raised their hand and called out loudly, "Ms. Simmons, would you like to comment on the fraud allegations being circulated right now?" The room went completely silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. She froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because in that single moment, the illusion cracked. Her eyes scanned the audience, searching for control, for stability. But there was none. Only suspicion. Only doubt. And I stood at the back of the room, watching as the woman who once controlled every aspect of my life realized she could no longer control this. She tried to speak, but her voice shook. I'm not aware of any." Another voice interrupted. "Documents show offshore shell companies linked directly to your firm. Can you explain that?" More murmurs erupted. The applause that once filled the room had vanished completely, replaced by something colder. Judgment. And as I watched her standing there under the harsh stage lights, suddenly exposed, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. What I felt was release. Like a heavy weight sliding off my chest after years of pressure. Because this wasn't about destroying her. It was about finally stepping out of her shadow. Weeks later, the fallout was absolute. Investigations launched. Her company's assets frozen. Partnerships dissolved overnight. Her reputation collapsed faster than anyone believed possible. People who once praised her distanced themselves immediately. Because power built on illusion doesn't survive exposure. I never saw her again after that day. She never called. Never wrote. But months later, I heard through legal channels that she had tried to argue that I acted out of personal vendetta. It didn't matter. The evidence spoke louder than any narrative she could spin. And one night, nearly a year after the voicemail, I finally deleted that message from my phone. Not because I forgot it, but because I didn't need it anymore. It no longer held power over me. Because the truth is, the moment she told me to never return, she thought she was erasing me. What she really did was set me free. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. Stories like this remind us that silence doesn't protect injustice, truth does. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone. It's simply refusing to remain invisible.